Hello everybody. Today we are going to start our unit on progressivism in America. And you can see right here, progressivism, the root word being progress, meaning to move forward. And what we're doing is we're moving forward from the problems and trying to fix the problems that were caused in the United States by the American Industrial Revolution. Okay, we talked about trying to fix the problems that were being caused by the Industrial Revolution, and to be a progressive, what you need to do is you are using the government to reform those problems. Two examples we're going to talk about. One is Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, and the other is Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom. These are both government programs that were initiated by these two presidents. Some of the things they were looking to reform were working conditions. They weren't looking to reform just working conditions. They were looking to reform all of society, working conditions, living conditions. But just talking about working conditions, things they were looking at, trying to fix the safety in the workplace, get rid of child labor. Now, it's interesting to note they didn't want to get rid of child labor because they thought kids should be in school. They wanted to get rid of child labor because kids could work for longer hours for less pay, and they were taking jobs away from adults. They were working on trying to get rid of the long hours, low wages, get better job security, get better benefits. They're trying to move away from this idea of a company town and trying to increase the employment of women, moving away from women working in their homes to women actually having a place in the work environment. The goals of the progressive movement, again, spanned all of society. They wanted a government controlled by the people as opposed to by large corporations. Now, you might even be able to argue that they never actually achieved that goal if you look at the government today. They wanted guaranteed economic opportunities. Okay, now this is an important one to realize. Economic opportunities does not mean they just wanted everyone to have money. They just wanted to have an equal opportunity through government regulation. We'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt, what he talks about later. But basically, this is not a socialist program, but what they're trying to do is just guarantee that everyone has a fair shot at the same opportunities as everyone else. They also are looking for an elimination of social injustices. Getting same rights for African Americans, same rights for women, and things like that. The progressives were able to accomplish a lot of things in governments. If they're going to reform society through government, the first thing they had to reform was the government itself. They looked for reforms in two ways. One was in local governments, the other was in state governments. Local government in Hanover would be like your Board of Supervisors, which you've heard me talk about in the past. State governments would be like the Virginia General Assembly. And these also would move into governments on the federal level. The progressives felt that the government was not doing enough to meet the increasing needs of urbanization. Moving from a agricultural-based society to an industrial-based society also meant going from a rural-based society to an urban-based society, and they felt that the government needed to change in order to meet those needs of urbanization. In state governments, they looked for things called referendum, initiative, and recall, which we'll talk about, and these are going to make the government more responsive to the people. One way they looked to reform local government was going to this thing called a city manager plan. The people would elect a city council, and the city council would appoint someone to be the city manager. And they had to make sure this person was going to be trained and not just a lackey or a buddy of one of the council members, that they were just doing this to make sure that their friends could get money. They had to be trained, and in order to guarantee that, they moved to something called the civil service test, or the civil servants test, using the Pendleton Civil Servant Act. And these people had to pass a test to prove that they were trained and they would be able to handle this job. And when they appointed this person was called the city manager. The city manager would then hire people based on their ability to do the job instead of using the spoil system, which we've talked about in the past, and just hiring their buddies. This was a practice that was used far too often in major cities because that's where a lot of money could be earned, but people were getting these jobs and they were not trained for them, and it led to some disastrous situations, just like in modern day, the Katrina Hurricane Katrina. George W. Bush appointed to the head of FEMA someone who probably should not have been in that position, and it is cited as a gross mismanagement of a disaster situation. So unfortunately, things like that still do happen, but the progressive eras back in the early 1900s, the progressive were trying to make sure things like that weren't rampant. At the state level, the progressives tried to get three major accomplishments: referendum, initiative, and recall. Referendum lets the people vote on whether or not they want to approve a new law. The school you are sitting in was built by a bond referendum. The Board of Supervisors had a vote, public vote, that said, do we want to raise taxes to build the new school? The people overwhelmingly said yes, and that is how the school, Hanover High School, was built. Referendum is basically a question that would people support this or would the people not support this. Every election, the last couple elections, there has been a referendum question for the state of Virginia, from everything on eminent domain to same-sex marriages. And this was to help make the government more responsive to the will of the majority of the people. Another way that the progressives wanted to make government more responsive to the will of the people is by using this thing called an initiative. An initiative allows ordinary people to propose legislation. What they would do is they would have to get people to sign a signature that says, you know, if it was in this school, do you want Chick-fil-A available for lunch every day? And they would go around, get people to sign a petition, and if enough people signed the petition, the state legislature would vote on it if there was a law. Before we had this idea of an initiative, the only way that things could get proposed into law was if the legislatures did it. And oftentimes they would only propose laws that would benefit people like them, other rich people. And one of the largest progressive accomplishments was this idea of a recall. The recall allows voters to remove politicians from office before their elected term is over. And what I'll show you here in the next couple slides is an example of a recall that happened in your lifetime in the state of California. Okay, this guy you see right here, his name is Gray Davis. In I believe 2003 or 2002, he was the governor of the state of California. He became so wildly unpopular that the citizens of California petitioned the government, and they had what was called a recall vote. And enough citizens of the state of California voted that they no longer wanted Gray Davis to be their governor. So they recalled him and they removed him from office. As part of that, following up that vote, they had to elect a new governor. And that gubernatorial race was wild. It had, I think, something like 60 or 70 candidates. Gary Coleman, the little short guy who played Arnold on Different Strokes, ran. An adult film star ran for governor. All sorts of different people ran for governor. The guy who won, though, was Arnold Schwarzenegger. So Gray Davis was recalled. Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor, and that is how he became the governor of California. So Gray Davis gets recalled. He gets kicked out. Arnold Schwarzenegger is voted in, and there he is. And I'm sure he had some sort of weird comment saying, you know, you've been governated, some sort of weird, stupid Terminator reference from when he used to be an action movie star. Just a couple more accomplishments of the progressives, besides just in government and elections. We have primary elections, just like we have today to choose our candidates. Prior to the progressives, that's not how we chose our candidates through primary runoffs and things like that. But because the progressives, again, all of this is about making the government more responsive to the people. We have the direct election of U.S. senators, which was part of the 17th Amendment. Prior to the passage of the 17th Amendment, state legislatures actually chose senators. People had no say into who their senator was. But again, part of making the government responsive to the will of the people, they decided, or the progressives pushed for, the direct election of U.S. senators. Also, the use of the secret ballot to make voting and make elections more to make them more fair. The ballots were now cast in secret. Before the progressives, what they would do is if you wanted to vote for a certain candidate or a certain party, you would pick up the color ballot of that person. Everyone could see who you were voted for. That was a very corruptible system because the officials who were trying to get elected to office, they would send their goons and henchmen to the polling places and threaten to beat up or harm voters if they didn't vote for their candidate, or they would offer rewards such as free food, free beer, free whatever, or even just straight up pay to people who voted for their candidate. And it was very easy to tell because the elections were not held in secret. You grab this colored paper ballot and that's how you would cast your vote. They looked for, again, advances in child labor. We talked about a little bit about muckraking. It says muckraking here is literature to describe the abuses of child labor, which is true, but that's not the only thing that is an example of muckraking literature. We'll talk about this a little bit later. We've already talked about it in class. One very famous example of muckraking literature is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which we have read in class, or we will read in class. And that is another example of muckraking literature. Again, all of these are accomplishments that still affect us today of the progressives in the early 1900s. Okay, some more accomplishments. We already talked about the muckraking, getting child labor laws passed, and things like that. Labor unions. We'll go more into depth with labor unions in another lecture. But a couple major organizations, some of which are still around today: the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, the American Railways Union, the Industrial Ladies Garment Workers Union, who became very active after the Triangle Waist Shirt Factory. And we'll talk about these strikes in a little bit more detail in another lecture. But some gains they had with limited work hours and better working conditions. Okay, just a couple other accomplishments of the progressives, and these are ones that really still affect us today, especially in the business world. The first one is the Sherman Antitrust Act. Oops, sorry about that. The Sherman Antitrust Act legislation that is passed as a direct result of businesses such as Rockefeller, Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel Company, J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel, to make sure that no more businesses can create structures. And the vocab here for the Sherman Antitrust Act is restrained trade. So basically they are outlawing monopolies. Another part of the Sherman Antitrust Act that is an unintended consequence is that it actually outlaws unions. So later on, we get the Clayton Antitrust Act, which expands the Sherman Antitrust Act, but also, more importantly, exempts unions from it, which is very important because now unions can use the strike as a tool to improve their working conditions, which we will talk about later. Another accomplishment of the progressive movement is the women's suffrage movement. It gets the women the right to vote, passed by a group of women's suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, who gave them very strong leadership. It is a precursor to the modern protest movement, which we see used very, very regularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially with the civil rights movement. The Women's Suffrage Act, besides getting the women's right to vote, also encouraged women to enter the workforce when the men went off to war in World War I, and eventually it results in the 19th Amendment to the Constitution outlawing the discrimination for voting based on gender. Okay, and like I talked about before, we're going to be talking about two separate presidential policies, one by Theodore Roosevelt, the other by Woodrow Wilson. The first one we're going to talk about is Teddy Roosevelt's, and his was called the Square Deal. The Square Deal had two branches. One was the environmental policies, and the other was the economic policies. Theodore Roosevelt is generally regarded as one of the most progressive presidents in history, using the government to really solve what he viewed as a lot of social problems, especially with the environment. Just real quick about President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. He was elected as a member of the Republican Party. Very oftentimes he is pictured as a moose, as we see right here. That comes from during one of his campaigns. I believe somebody asked him how he was feeling, and he said, "I am as healthy as a bull moose." And that nickname stuck, and eventually he runs for president as a member of the Bull Moose Party, which is an offshoot of the Republican Party that believed in Roosevelt's ideals and policies. So the whole purpose from Roosevelt's Square Deal was to keep the rich and powerful from taking advantage of the small business owners and the poor. Roosevelt saw the society at the time as a haves versus the have-nots. And we talked about this a little bit in class, but Roosevelt didn't want to take from the rich and give to the poor in a socialist or communist style of government. What Roosevelt wanted to do was make sure that no one could take advantage of anyone else. He didn't want them to be able to use the government or use the economic system that was in place to keep people down if they had the resources to pick themselves up. He didn't want to give the poor people money. He didn't want to give them anything. He just wanted to make sure that they weren't being taken advantage of. The next two slides are quotes by Teddy Roosevelt. The first one is, he said, "In football, as in life, the principle to follow is hit the line hard." Teddy Roosevelt didn't pull any punches. He was very aggressive. He said exactly what was on his mind, and people really respected him for it. And he really went after things that he thought were social injustices, and he went after people that they thought were wrong. And in his mind, just like in football, he was hitting the line hard. Here's just another quote by Roosevelt for explaining kind of what he, in his mind, believes it means to be a progressive. "When I say I believe in a square deal, I do not mean to give every man the best hand. If good cards do not come to any man, or if they do come and he has not got the power to play them, that is his affair. All I mean is that there shall be no crookedness in the dealing." And I apologize for the typo right here. That should be, there shall be no crookedness in the dealing. But basically what Roosevelt is trying to say is that he's not going to give a handout to anyone. Everyone has to work for themselves. He just wants to make sure that everyone gets dealt from the same deck of cards, that there is no crookedness in the dealing. That means that everyone is getting a fair shake. The first part of the Square Deal, Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, we are going to talk about is the economic branch of the Square Deal. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt was known as the great trustbuster, one of the great trustbusters of all time. Basically, he kind of made his mark by breaking up monopolies. And one of the examples was sticking up for workers' rights. In 1902, there was a coal miners' strike. Workers wanted shorter hours and higher wages. Roosevelt definitely could sympathize with that. He understood that people wanted longer, more pay for less time, but he knew that the country needed coal. The coal ran everything. Trains ran on coal, power plants ran on coal. He understood that, so if the coal miners didn't get back to work, the country would be in a lot of trouble. Roosevelt tried to bargain with the mine owners to get the workers back to work, but he couldn't. The negotiations ultimately failed. So what Roosevelt did, he said he would threaten to send in the army if the coal mine owners could not get the workers back to work. This actually scared the mine owners enough to give the workers a minor raise. So, because mark this down, that this was the first time in U.S. history the federal government ever stepped in to end a labor dispute. Another example of Roosevelt busting up trust was the railroads. The railroad industry was technically a monopoly. They could charge whatever they wanted to. This was a major problem for Western farmers. They needed to ship their goods back east, and the only way they could do it was the railroads. The railroads would often give things called rebates or special deals that companies would give to special clients. Like Rockefeller got a lot of rebates. Morgan and Carnegie got a lot of rebates. Roosevelt steps in and ends this because he saw this as being unfair to the farmers. Even though the Interstate Commerce Commission was already set up to regulate the rails, the Supreme Court had made it so it had actually no teeth. The railroads didn't have to listen to them. So Roosevelt steps in, passes legislation that ends the railroad monopoly. As part of taking on the railroad, Roosevelt gets Congress to pass two acts. One is the Elkins Act, and the other is the Hepburn Act. The Elkins Act fines railways who give special rates to just certain customers like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan. It wanted to stop the big businessmen from taking advantage of the railroads. We just talked about how the Interstate Commerce Commission had no real authority. Well, the Hepburn Act gives them that authority. It sets and limits shipping costs. It sets prices for ferries, bridge tolls, etc. These are two things that are still in play today, especially the Elkins Act. The setting prices for ferries and tolls and stuff, that's more left to the states now. But Roosevelt took on a major industry and again won, which is why he was known as the Great Trustbuster. Guys like Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie, they didn't like this so much. They were against it. But again, Roosevelt promised to stop businessmen like them from taking advantage from poor, humble farmers. Another act that Teddy Roosevelt got to pass was the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act is still around today. In fact, Microsoft not too long ago got fined under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act prevents any business structure that restrains trade. We talked about in a couple slides ago that this actually did include unions. Later on, the Clayton Antitrust Act would come around to say that unions were okay. But basically, the Sherman Antitrust Act outlaws monopolies, and that is another piece of legislation pushed through by Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt got rid of the railroad trust, the beef trust, the agriculture trust. He differentiated between good trusts and bad trusts. In his mind, you could have a monopoly as long as you did things fairly. But if you were a trust and you did things unfairly, Roosevelt was going to come after you. Another part of Roosevelt's square deal was regulating the food and drug industry, and this was a direct result of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which we have gone over in class. We'll go over that a little bit more in this section, but also how Upton Sinclair's literature led to a massive, wide-scale social reform of the food and drug industry in the early 1900s. On the left there, you see a copy of the cover of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It was a novel. It was supposed to be a historical satire or a fictional representation of events that are actually happening, of a Lithuanian immigrant, Jurgis, and his wife. On the right there, you see a drawing of Upton Sinclair. A major part of the progressive movement was the up-and-coming media. We have heard I don't know if you've heard the adage, the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, once again, the pen proves to be mightier than the sword. Progressives were able to use the media to expose the problems that they wanted to have fixed and gain support for their cause. If you remember from Chapter 9 of The Jungle, when they talk about men working in tank rooms full of steam and falling into giant vats of boiling water, this is what they were talking about. You can see that they're right at about knee level, right around the level of the floor, which are very easy to fall into. They use these hooks to have these whole pigs. They send them down this way. This thing right here will rotate to dump pigs into the boiling water. You can see they don't have any protection. All they're wearing is aprons, so it's kind of a tough place to work. We've gone over this in class, but again, a quote from Chapter 14 of The Jungle. There would be meat that had tumbled out onto the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had trampled and spit uncounted billions of germs. There would be meat stored in rooms, and thousands of rats would race about it. A man could run his hands over these piles of meat and sweep handfuls of dried rat dung. These rats were nuisances, and packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. That quote right there kind of struck a chord with people because they didn't want to be eating rats and poisoned bread and rat poop in their food. So again, using the media, they were able to push forward social legislation. His novel, people were outraged because the owners, these rich elite industrialists, completely disregarded the basic health standards. The government took action as part of this progressive movement, and it led to federal regulation of food and drugs, pharmaceuticals. The next couple photos that you're going to see are just pictures of the meatpacking industry in Chicago, not necessarily related to the jungle, but you can kind of get the idea of some of the working conditions. Here is, we had talked about when the meat was stamped and injected with pickle. Here you have pigs that have had their heads removed. This is where their head would be. They're being stamped as 1, 2, or 3 grade, like you saw, and then these right here are to inject the meat with the pickling substance. Okay, in this picture there are many different things. Over here you have the heads of pigs hanging up. You have the ribs or the backbone here and also here. It looks like maybe pig's ears or feet or hams right here. Innards being carted off right here, and barrels. I'm not quite sure what would be in there, but again, you can tell just by looking at the picture. It's dark, it's not very well lit, it doesn't look very sanitary to have all that meat just be hanging out in the open like that. In this picture, I believe you have the boners. Or they're cutting the carcasses in half with these giant machete-like things right here. You know, when we read in the jungle about how it was hard to find a man who scarcely had the use of his thumb, when you're swinging things like that all day, you know, accidents can very easily happen. Right here you have the sausage machines, or sausage making machines, I guess. You can't see the caption, but it said that these would come out at about 10 feet per second. You might not remember exactly about the sausage when reading the book, but do you remember how everything was put into the hoppers? This right here is the sausage hopper. All the meat would go in there, and then it would come out down here and be put into casings. It looks like hot dogs because that's exactly how hot dogs are made, but that's also how sausages are made. And when it talked about the dead rats and the poison meat and all that being put in, that's where it would be put in. Within 9 months of the jungle being published, both the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act were passed. We talked earlier in the lecture about this idea of muckraking, exposing the problems of society through literature. The jungle is a perfect example of that. Upton Sinclair's jungle got these things passed. Now, Sinclair wrote this to expose the working conditions of immigrants to the American people, but what he did was expose the meatpacking industry, and because of that, the government had to take action against these rich, arrogant businessmen to protect the citizens from them. Theodore Roosevelt actually reads a copy of The Jungle, and he is infuriated by it. He urges Congress to pass these acts. The Meat Inspection Act allows a federal inspection of the meatpacking plants, and the Pure Food and Drug Act banned interstate shipment of impure food and mislabeling of food and drugs. That is why today it is so important that all of the food and things you eat are labeled. If you look on the back of any bottled drink, anything you eat, it always has the ingredients that are in it, and that is a federal regulation, and that was passed in 1906 and is still affecting us to this day. Very quickly, we're just going to go over some of Roosevelt's environmental policies. He was a conservationist. He wanted to conserve the environment. He was an avid hunter. He went on safari in Africa, and he loved being outdoors. He was an avid outdoorsman. So he really worked to conserve the environment. One of the things he did was set up 100 million acres of forest land for what they called rational use policies. He basically defined this as a wise use of natural resources. Not that they couldn't be completely unused, but they had to be used wisely. And that was Roosevelt's idea, that he could wisely use the natural resources. He set aside, they quadrupled the number of acreage under federal protection, set aside land for the Yosemite national parks and Yellowstone national parks and all of those things. Again, very avid outdoorsman, environmentalist, and wanted to protect nature from the encroachment of urbanization. Here you see a picture of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 men standing in front of a redwood tree. This might be the biggest tree I have ever seen in my entire life. Redwood trees are absolutely enormous. In fact, if you go out to California, there's a road where the road actually goes through the arch of a redwood tree. What it does is there's actually a tunnel cut through the redwood tree, just like this, and it is big enough for a car going each way to pass through. So that's how enormous these trees are, and Roosevelt saw the value in that and wanted to preserve that for future generations. Roosevelt even reformed spelling. He standardized spelling in the United States. Things that used to be, you could have two spellings, things like color, that could be spelled C-O-L-O-U-R, or color, C-O-L-O-R. Roosevelt said, nope, we're only going to use one, and he got rid of the English version of spelling things and only went with the American version of spelling. Okay, last 4 slides we're going to talk about here are Woodrow Wilson being a progressive president and his new freedom. Now, Woodrow Wilson wasn't as progressive as we like to think. He fought against women's suffrage. He had racist tendencies, but he still did have progressive policies. Wilson reformed tariffs. He lowered tariffs. It was the first time tariffs had ever been lowered since the Civil War. Again, he was trying to protect the regular people from the rich industrialists. And if you remember back from the Civil War, the rich industrialists were mostly in the North, and they really favored tariffs to protect their industry, but it didn't necessarily help the farmers and the mechanics and the regular people in the South. So Woodrow Wilson, again, trying to protect people from the Industrial Revolution and trying to right the wrongs of the Industrial Revolution, lowered the tariff. Wilson's deal was known as the New Freedom. He believed that the government's role was to create a level playing field, just like Roosevelt believed. He believed in individual energy and business competition would give Americans lives both decent and free from that idea of the big brother intrusion. It's kind of weird for us to think about that government could not be part of our daily lives, but that was the goal of Wilson, that you could live your entire life and not even know the government existed. So he wanted to go after, too, all trust. Roosevelt differentiated between good and bad trust. Wilson went after all trust. So he wanted to break up monopolies, and that was his goal, so that the playing field for all people was completely level. 2 acts passed under Wilson. One was the Federal Trade Act that could stop illegal businesses. The other was the Clayton Antitrust Act, which we kind of talked about before, which declared certain type of businesses illegal in order to prevent monopoly. This made unions illegal. The Clayton Antitrust Act made unions legal in all 50 states. Except however, now there are about 28 states in the past 50 or so years. There have been many states that have unions passed laws to restrict the rights of unions. Virginia is one of them, and I believe Wisconsin is the most recent state to reduce the rights of unions. The Clayton Antitrust Act is important because now strikes, boycotts, picketing, the collection of strike benefit funds, all of those things were ruled legal. And again, that is just an enhancement of the freedom of the common workers as opposed to the government working for the big businesses. Another creation under Wilson was the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply and therefore can affect the value of currency. Now, this is kind of tough, so if someone reminds me, we'll go over it in class on exactly what that means, but it set up a Federal Farm Loan Act and set up farm loan banks to support farmers. And again, that was just to create a level playing field so all people had the same opportunity. Okay, folks, and that is the down and dirty edition of the Progressive Era. And again, please, if you have any questions, bring them to class. We will be going over discussion questions in class. And until I see you again, that is it. And I hope you enjoyed this video lecture.